The longship hits the beach before dawn, and you are already running. Not because you are brave, because the man behind you is running, and the man behind him, and the tide doesn't wait, and neither does the light. Your boots are wet. They've been wet for 9 days. The cold of the North Sea has moved up through your legs so slowly you stopped noticing it somewhere around Norway, and now it lives in your knees like a second skeleton, one made of ice, grinding. You are not a monster. That is the first thing you need to know. You are a farmer who has not eaten a full meal in 2 weeks, crossing a foreign beach in the grey hour before the world wakes up, thinking about the land you left behind, the barley field, the fence that needed mending, your wife's face in the doorway the morning you left, not saying anything because there was nothing to say that would have helped. The raid is not who you are, it is something you do, the way a storm is something the sky does. And then the sky clears and becomes itself again. But right now, the sky is not clear. The monastery on the hill is lit by a single torch, still and small and alive. You can see it from the water. And the thing you feel standing there, ankle deep in cold gravel, the beach shifting under your feet, your hands gripping the hull of the ship you helped build last winter with your own hands, is not bloodlust. It is something closer to dread. A dread you chose. A dread you saved up for. By the time this night is over, you will have done things that monks on the far side of the water will record as a visitation from God's wrath. History will make you into something enormous and inhuman. It will give you horns, which you never wore. It will make you a force of nature, which is easier than making you a person. This is the life of a Norse raider, and it is nothing like the story you were told. Settle in. The fire is low and steady. Let the cold come off your shoulders. There is time tonight to understand all of it. The image that survived 1,000 years is a simple one. Horned helmets, burning villages, screaming monks, men made entirely of violence arriving from the sea like a punishment from God. The Norse appear in the written record mostly through the accounts of the people they raided, and those people, largely ecclesiastical scholars, men for whom the pen was a professional tool, were understandably not interested in nuance. They were interested in surviving, and then in recording what had happened to them, and those records tend toward the vivid and the absolute. The raid on Lindisfarne in 793, a monastery on a small island off the northeastern coast of England, was recorded in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle with a quality of horror that still reads as raw 12 centuries later. The chronicler wrote of portents, dragons seen flying in the sky, violent whirlwinds, lightning flashing, a great famine. And then, almost without transition, the pagans came from the sea. That framing, the pagans from the sea like weather, defined how the Norse were understood for generations. It was not invented. There was real violence at Lindisfarne. People died. Sacred objects were taken. The trauma was not imagined. But the frame captured only one face of something with many. The world the Norse actually lived in was Scandinavia, what is now Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. A landscape of fjords and deep pine forests and coastlines so intricate and interrupted that the sea was never a barrier between places. It was the road. The Norse were sailors the way other medieval cultures were horsemen. The boat was the natural vehicle of their world, and most children who grew up near water learned to handle one before they were old enough to do much else. And most of them, most of these terrifying raiders, were farmers. This is worth sitting with. The men who devastated the coasts of England and Ireland and France went home after assemblies, raiding season to plant crops. They kept cattle. They made cheese. They repaired fences. They argued with their neighbors at legal assemblies about property boundaries and unpaid debts. The same man who pulled an oar toward Lindisfarne in June was bent over a furrow in April, willing the barley to grow before the first frost closed the year back down. The Norse farm was not a gentle place. Scandinavia's growing season was brutal, short, cold, relentless. Arable land was scarce. In Norway especially, the terrain meant that usable farmland clung to fjord edges in thin ribbons, and a family that lost a season to bad weather or livestock disease could find itself on the edge of real starvation before the next thaw. The pressure to produce, to preserve, to survive the winter, it was constant, and it was never fully resolved. And this is where the raids begin to make a different kind of sense. When the land cannot give enough, the sea offers an alternative. When a farm cannot support all the sons who might inherit it, the boat becomes the answer, not an answer born of bloodlust, but of arithmetic. The raid was, at its core, a resource problem solved violently, a way to take what the land refused to provide. The world as it appeared was monsters from the sea. The world as it was, a society of farmers and sailors and craftsmen and traders, running the numbers, doing what winter demanded, is harder to fit on a monastery wall. But it is the true story, and it begins long before the longship hits the beach. You are 12 years old, and you are learning to row, not on the sea, on the river behind your family's farm, in a small boat your father built from pine planks and pine tar. Your hands blister. They bleed a little. You keep going, because in the Norse world, the person who can handle a boat and the person who can survive are the same person. The training starts young, and it doesn't look like training. It looks like being useful. Time a Norse boy was old enough to join a raiding crew, he had been farming and sailing for most of his conscious life. The skills were not separate domains. Sailing demanded the same reading of wind and current and sky that farming demanded of soil and temperature and season. Both required patience. Both punished bad decisions immediately. Both were, in their own way, negotiations with forces that didn't care whether you lived. The longship itself is worth pausing on, because it is one of the genuine engineering marvels of the medieval world, and the thing people tend to be most surprised by. A Viking longship was built using overlapping planks, a method called clinker construction, which gave the hull a flexibility that rigidly framed boats didn't have. It flexed with the waves instead of fighting them. It drew barely a meter of water when fully loaded, which meant it could navigate rivers and shallow coastlines that deeper-hulled vessels couldn't approach. Under oar and sail, a well-crewed longship could cover 150 miles in a single day. And here is the detail that stops people cold. A Viking longship was light enough to be carried overland. When Norse traders and explorers operating the river routes through what is now Russia reached a point where one drainage system ended and another began, they portaged their ships. They lifted them out of the water and carried them across land to the next river. These were shallower rivercraft, cousins to the open sea longship, built for the same principles but adapted to inland water. And still, crew and all, they were moved by hand across ground. The Norse understanding of what a boat could do did not include the concept of impassable. This should already be rewriting the image. These were not raiders who happened to have boats. They were a maritime civilization of extraordinary sophistication, for whom the line between warrior and craftsman, and merchant and farmer, was not a line at all, it was a braid. The same person did all of it in different seasons, with different tools, toward the same end. And the word itself, the word Viking, the word we use for all of them, did not mean what we think it means. In Old Norse, Viking was a verb, not a noun, a verb. To go a Viking meant to go on an expedition, usually overseas, usually in the summer months. It was a seasonal activity, the way going to market was an activity, not an identity, not a permanent state. A man could go a Viking for 2 summers, come home with silver and grain, and then spend the next 30 years never leaving his valley. History would not have called him a Viking. His neighbors would not have called him a Viking. He would simply have been the man who owned the farm by the birch trees and had gone trading overseas for a while when he was young. The word became a noun, became a people, became a legend, through the writings of those on the receiving end of the raids. People who didn't stop to ask what the men on the beach would have called themselves, because there were more urgent things to address, but the nuance is the whole story. And when you carry it back to the beach at dawn, the wet boots, the cold gravel, the torch on the hill, the scene doesn't become less frightening. It becomes more honest, and somehow more human. Think about how long winter is in the north. Not a calendar winter, a real one. The kind where the light leaves in October and doesn't come back in any meaningful form until March. Where the question of whether your family survives until spring is not rhetorical. Where every decision made in summer, how much hay you cut, how many animals you slaughter before the cold arrives, how carefully you sealed the grain stores, plays out over months of dark and cold that offer no second chances. This is what the Norse lived inside, most of the time, not raids. Winter. The Norse farm day began before the sun, because in Scandinavia's northern latitudes, summer daylight could last nearly 20 hours, and winter offered as few as 6. The year was not a gentle arc of seasons. It was a compression and expansion of time itself. Summer, a burst of desperate productivity. Winter, a long interior withdrawal. The shoulder seasons, a kind of held breath. You worked when the light allowed, and you rested when it didn't. And the seasons set the tempo whether you agreed with them or not. The center of Norse domestic life was the longhouse, a single large structure, sometimes up to 30 meters in length, that housed the family, the farm animals, and all the tools and stores of a working farmstead under one roof. Animals at one end, cattle, sheep, goats, pigs. Family at the other, around a central hearth that burned continuously through the winter months. The animals' body heat rose and moved through the building. In the coldest weeks, it made the difference between comfortable and survivable. The women of the household ran most of what kept the farm alive through winter, and this is not a footnote. It is the structural reality. Norse women held more legal standing than almost any other women in the medieval world. They could own property. They could divorce. They could run businesses and participate in the things, the community legal assemblies where Norse society governed itself. The mistress of the farm wore her household keys on a ring at her belt, keys to the grain stores, the locked chests, the storage buildings. The keys were not decorative. They were proof of authority over the farm's most critical resources, and they appear in the burial goods of high-status Norse women with striking regularity. While raiding took the men overseas from late spring through early fall, the women managed the farms, entirely and alone. They supervised the agricultural work, decided which animals to slaughter before winter, directed the preservation of food, managed the household. Economics. The farm that the raiders came home to had been kept alive by the person who stayed. And then there was the craft work, because Norse farm communities were not dependent on distant markets for most of what they needed. Cloth was woven at home on vertical looms. Leather was tanned and worked into shoes and harnesses and carrying bags. Iron tools were forged by local smiths. Woodwork, furniture, tools, the frames of buildings, the ribs of boats required constant skill and constant maintenance. Every person on a Norse farm had multiple functional competencies that, in a modern context, would constitute separate professions. The men who raided were not men who sat idle in peacetime. The same hands that gripped an oar in summer were calloused from the plough in spring, the haymaking fork in July, the wood-cutting axe in October. And here is the thing that made all of this real in a way that written sources alone cannot: the bodies. Archaeological analysis of Viking Age, skeletal remains from Scandinavia, has found something quietly remarkable. Many of the men buried with weapons, swords, axes, spears, the full equipment of a warrior, show patterns of degenerative arthritis in their lower backs and hands, not the joint wear of men who trained for combat. The specific grinding wear pattern produced by decades of heavy agricultural labor. Bending, lifting, digging, repetitive motion, season after season, until the bones record it permanently. The warrior in the grave with his sword had spent more hours bent over a field than swinging that blade. The body doesn't lie, and neither does the land. There is something you need to feel before the facts help you. A carved stone from the island of Gotland in Sweden, made sometime in the 8th or 9th century, shows a longship under full sail in the lower panel, and in the upper panel, a figure arriving at what scholars believe is the Hall of Odin, being greeted by a woman with a drinking horn. The stone is beautiful. It is also a compression of the entire Norse worldview into a single image: the voyage and the arrival, the sea and the afterlife, the thing you cross and the place you end up. The Norse understood life as a journey between two unknowns, and the journey itself, the crossing, was where meaning lived. This is not a modern interpretation. It is embedded in the language, the mythology, the funerary practice. Norse burial ships were real boats. Not symbols, not miniatures. Actual seaworthy ships. In some cases, filled with goods and tools and animals. The boat was not a metaphor for passage. It was the passage. You took the actual thing. And inside this belief system, the raider and the farmer were not opposites. They were the same person in different seasons. The contradiction the rest of the medieval world couldn't reconcile was this: how could a man be genuinely brutal in June and then come home in October and be a decent neighbor, a loving father, someone who carved small wooden things for his children by firelight, someone who knew the names of his cattle, someone who sat at the thing and voted on legal disputes with the same seriousness he brought to everything else? Imagine it for a moment. It is deep winter. A fire burns in the longhouse, low, steady, the smell of pine smoke and animals and something cooking. Outside, the fjord is grey and sealed with ice. The cattle shift and breathe at the far end of the building, that slow, warm sound. A man is sitting near the hearth with a piece of birchwood in his hands, a small curved knife working slowly. He is carving a horse. There are others like it in this house, worn smooth by small hands, objects made with real care and real time. He is not performing softness, not stepping temporarily out of a violent life. This is who he is, most of the time. The raid is the exception. This is the rule. The brutality was real. Let's not soften it. The raids devastated communities. People died, were enslaved, lost everything they had built. The trauma that a Norse raid left in a coastal settlement was not small, and it did not heal quickly. The men who carried it out made choices. They planned the violence. They executed it. They were not innocent, but the humanity was also real. And the two things existed in the same person. We tend to want our historical figures sorted. Violent people here, gentle ones there. The Norse refused to be sorted. The same culture that produced some of the most feared raiders in the medieval world also produced extraordinary poetry, intricate metalwork, and wood carving. a legal tradition that protected women's rights, and a mythology obsessed with honor, loyalty, and the proper way to meet an ending, not instead of the violence, alongside it, woven through it, the way a river is woven through the land it runs through, inseparable from the thing it moves across. The wooden horse doesn't cancel the raid. The raid doesn't cancel the wooden horse. Both are true. And the discomfort of holding both at once is, perhaps, the closest we can come to actually understanding them. He was never one thing. None of them were. Here is what the sagas don't prepare you for. The Norse didn't simply raid. For long stretches of the Viking Age, roughly 793 to 1066, raiding and trading were often the same activity, carried out by the same people, on the same ships, in the same season. The difference between them was frequently one of opportunity and circumstance, rather than intent. A Norse crew arriving at a coastal settlement had options. If the settlement was defended, or if it had goods the Norse wanted and could negotiate for, they traded. If it was undefended and had goods the Norse wanted and couldn't negotiate for, they raided. The hold of the ship saw furs and amber and walrus ivory go out, and silver and grain and cloth come back, regardless of which method produced the return. The economic logic was identical, only the violence varied. This is documented in the records of Norse contact with settlements that survived regular interaction, the trading towns of the Baltic, the ports of England, the Frankish coast. Norse traders were a known and accepted presence in many of these places. They had established market days, recognized weights, long-term commercial relationships. The same people who raided Lindisfarne maintained peaceful trading arrangements with towns 50 miles away, not because they were inconsistent, but because the goal was always the same: acquire what you need from the places that have it. The method was selected based on the resistance encountered. Now here is the thing that reframes everything. The majority of men who went raiding during the Viking Age did so for a short portion of their lives, often just a handful of years, usually in early adulthood. And the primary economic motivation was not plunder as an end in itself, based on what historians have been able to reconstruct from settlement patterns, inheritance records, and the distribution of silver hoards across Scandinavia. The driving pressure appears to have been land. In much of Scandinavia, inheritance custom heavily favored the eldest son. Younger sons inherited little or nothing in many regions. In a society where land was the only reliable foundation of wealth and stability, being a second or third son was a structural problem with no good domestic solution. The farm could not be divided indefinitely. The land was already at its limit. And so the boat became the answer. Not an answer of violence for violence's sake, but the answer to a very specific question. How does a man with no inheritance become a man with something to pass on? The raid was, for many of these men, the fastest available method of accumulating enough portable wealth. Silver, primarily, to purchase or establish their own land somewhere else. Not to remain violent. To stop having to be. The long-term goal of many Norse raiders was settlement. They raided to afford farms, and then they farmed. The Norse settlements in Normandy, in Ireland, in England, in Iceland, in the Faroe Islands. These were not conquered territories maintained by permanent warlords. They were farms. Norse settlers arrived by ship, acquired land by various means, and then planted things and built things and raised children who did not grow up to be raiders at all. In Iceland, which had no indigenous population when the Norse arrived around 874, settlers established within a century a functioning agricultural society with its own parliament, the Althing, one of the oldest representative assemblies in world history. The raiders built parliaments. The men who burned monasteries created legal systems. And they did it not because they were secretly civilized all along, but because stability and governance were the point. The raid was never the destination. It was the road. When you carry that understanding back to the beach at dawn, the man running across the cold gravel, his hands on the hull of the ship he spent all winter building, something shifts. He is not running toward a life of violence. He is running toward the thing that will let him stop. The longship and the plow are not opposites. One is paying for the other, and the payment will eventually be complete, and the farm will remain, and the longship will be pulled above the tide line, and that will be that. You don't have to admire it, but you can't look away from it either. It is too recognizable for that. The sea took people. This is not a poetic statement. It is a statistical one. Norse maritime culture operated at a level of risk that most modern people have no reference point for. Crossing the North Sea in a clinker-built longship, in late spring or early summer, in reasonable weather, was genuinely dangerous. Crossing it in a North Atlantic storm, the kind that arrived without warning and carried sustained winds above 50 knots, was frequently fatal. The Norse had sophisticated navigational knowledge. They read the sun and stars, ocean swells, bird behavior, the color and temperature of the water. None of it was sufficient against everything the sea was capable of. The sagas are full of ships that departed and never came back. Settlements were attempted and abandoned because sustaining them across open ocean was beyond what the technology and the numbers could support. The Norse settlement of Vinland, the landing in what is now Newfoundland, around the year 1000 CE, 5 centuries before Columbus, was eventually abandoned. Conflict with the indigenous population was part of it. But so was the simple, brutal arithmetic of distance. Too far, too exposed, too hard to reinforce. Every family that sent men to sea in spring understood, on some level, that they might not return. This understanding was not hidden or suppressed. It was woven into the culture, into the mythology, into the poetry, into the way the Norse talked about death and fate and the proper way to face both. The sea was not presented as safe. The sagas don't romanticize the crossing. They describe it as what it was, a negotiation with something that owed you nothing. And then there were the wars that weren't raids. Norse communities fought each other with the same intensity they directed outward. The internal politics of Scandinavian kingdoms and chiefdoms during the Viking Age was intricate and violent. The sagas are full of blood feuds, multi-generational conflicts between families, triggered by an insult or an unsettled debt that could consume entire communities across decades. A man who survived foreign raids could come home and die in a local dispute over grazing rights. The violence was not contained at the borders. It lived inside the society too, and the raids themselves left marks on the men who carried them out. We have no direct psychological accounts. The Norse didn't write that kind of record. But we have the poetry. The skaldic tradition, which produced highly formal, technically demanding verse considered a serious art form, is full of imagery that suggests something more than uncomplicated triumph. Poems about the weight of a reputation that requires constant maintenance through violence, about the loneliness of being far from home in a country whose language you don't speak, about the exhaustion that comes with a life measured in crossings. There is a verse in the Havamal, a collection of Norse wisdom poetry, that is often read as a warrior's creed. Rendered roughly, cattle die, kinsmen die, the self must also die. But one thing never dies, the reputation of those who are gone. It is offered as heroism. Read it quietly, in the dark. Everything dies. Everyone dies. The only thing that outlasts you is what others say, and you won't be there to hear it. That is not heroism without Cost. That is a reckoning with impermanence so clear-eyed it nearly takes your breath away. The man who came home from raiding with silver in his bag had paid for it. With time, with risk, with things he saw and did that the farm and the fire and the small carved horse could soothe, but not erase. The Norse knew this. The sagas knew this. The poetry knew this. They went anyway. And what they built with that cost is still standing. What the Norse left behind is everywhere, once you know how to look. The days of the week carry their names. Tuesday belongs to Tyr, Norse god of law and justice. Wednesday to Woden, the anglicized form of Odin. Thursday to Thor. Friday to Frigg, goddess of marriage and foresight, Odin's wife. 4 days out of 7, every week, every year, across the entire English-speaking world. The Norse are that deeply embedded in ordinary life, not as monuments, not as museums, but in the names of days, spoken without thinking, by people who have no idea they are reaching back 1,000 years each time they schedule a meeting. The settlement of Iceland produced the Icelandic sagas, a body of literature composed in the 13th and 14th centuries, drawing on oral traditions stretching back to the Viking Age, considered among the great works of medieval literature. They are vivid and precise and psychologically acute. They contain fully realized female characters, unreliable narrators, morally ambiguous protagonists who do things the reader cannot defend and cannot stop caring about. Detailed descriptions of landscape and weather that read as entirely modern. The people who wrote them down were the descendants of the farmers who arrived by longship into an empty island and made something from nothing. The Norse trading networks connected the known world in ways still visible. Traders operating out of what is now Sweden established river routes through what is now Russia, linking Scandinavia to the Byzantine Empire and the markets of the Islamic Caliphate. Historians have traced Norse settlements and trading posts along these river systems all the way to the Black Sea. The evidence in the ground, runestones, silver hoards, Arabic coins, tells the story the written sources only partially do. The Varangian Guard, Norse mercenaries in the service of the Byzantine emperors, were considered the most reliable soldiers in the known world for nearly 2 centuries. Constantinople and Newfoundland and the Upper Volga, all within the same 2-century window. The reach was genuinely staggering. And the farming. Always, underneath everything, the farming. Norse agricultural practice traveled with every settlement they established. The landscapes of Iceland, the Scottish Islands, coastal Normandy, the Irish Midlands. All of them carry the imprint of Norse agricultural knowledge in their soil and their place names. In the north of England, in Ireland's east coast, in the valleys of Normandy, the Norse left their language in the land itself, names of fields and rivers and hills given by farmers who stayed when the raiding was over. Old Norse words for geography, fell, dale, thwaite, beck, wick, still mark the English landscape in the places where the Norse settled and put down roots. They came to raid, they stayed to farm, and the farming outlasted the raiding by 1,000 years. Come back to the beach. The longship is there, pulled above the tide line. But it is autumn now, not dawn, not dark. The light is going golden early, the air carrying the first edge of cold that will deepen to frost in a week or 2. The crew has been home for a month. The silver has been divided. The wounds have mostly healed. And one of the older men, someone who has done this before, who knows what comes next, has begun to work on the hull, not repairing it, dismantling it. The longship that crossed the North Sea, that navigated by stars and swells and the behavior of birds is being taken apart plank by plank and reworked into something new. The curved ribs become rafters. The long planks become walls. The vessel of crossing, the thing that made the raid possible, that carried men away from everything familiar and brought them back again, is becoming a building, a storage shed, somewhere to keep the grain and the tools through winter. The Norse did this, not always, not universally, but it happened, and it is documented. And it is one of the most quietly remarkable images in all of medieval history. The sword into a plowshare is a metaphor. The longship into a grain store is a fact. This is what the Viking Age actually was, beneath the terror and the poetry and the mythology that gathered around it over centuries. It was people doing what they had to do to survive, and sometimes doing brutal things in the process, and then coming home and putting the brutal thing aside and picking up the small thing, the carved horse, the fence post, the seed for next spring, and continuing. Because the farm continued. Because winter came, and the farm continued regardless of what you had done in summer, and the work of living had to be taken up again. And if that sounds ordinary, that's because it is. Ordinary is the most enduring thing there is. The man on the beach who was running at dawn is not running now. He is lifting a plank, setting it against another, the ship becoming shelter, the vessel of violence becoming the thing that holds the grain through the cold months, the thing that keeps the family fed until the light returns. The farm remains. If this kind of story is what you're looking for, other worlds, other lives, samurai and silk roads and the quiet corners of empires most people never think about, subscribe, and there will be more. The history goes on for a long time, and there are quiet places in it worth finding. But for now, the longship is still. The grain is stored. The ice is moving in from the north, slow and certain, the way it always has. Close your eyes. You are here. The cold is outside, and you are warm, and the night is long and quiet and entirely safe. The crossing is done.